All right. On behalf of the Sports and Entertainment Law Society, I want to welcome everyone to this talk on the legality of the BCS, presented by Alan Fishel of Arent Fox. We're just going to go. He's going to give a short talk, and then we're going to open it up to the floor for questions. But also just another quick plug. Coming up later this month, we're going to have another speaker come in, Chris Griffin, who's going to do a talk on NCAA infractions. So we hope to see you all at that event as well. And I'm going to give it to Mr. Fishel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I graduated from Duke Law School 25 years ago now, and it's great to be here and be back. So a couple things up front. I represent, and have represented for the last 3 years, the Mountain West Conference and Boise State. Boise State has moved into the Mountain West Conference, as many as you know. I started representing Boise well before they moved into the Mountain West. I've been over at the Department of Justice many times talking about this issue. Been on lots of phone calls with them as well, discussing the matter. And so I'm coming at it from that background, and 3 years sort of living the whole BCS issue. And when you're on the outside, even if you're really a sports fan, you get to know it pretty well. When you get on the inside, you really get to realize what you didn't know and what you now know. So what I want to do is just give 30 seconds of real quick background for those of you who aren't as much sports fans or may not know sort of the details of where we're coming from. So a couple things. The BCS controls the five major bowls. So you have 5 major bowl games. Secondly, we're only dealing here with FBS. So we should only be dealing with the teams in the top divisions, which is the 120 teams in FBS, which is made up of 116 teams that are in conferences, 4 teams that are independent. Of those, we've got the 6 AQ conferences. When I say the word AQ, I mean automatic qualifying conferences. That means their champions automatically get into one of the major bowls every year. And then you've got the 5 non-AQs, non-automatic qualifying conferences. That means their champs do not automatically get into a major bowl every year. So I want to give that as sort of the background of where I'm coming from here. So the way that I look at it and the way that we look at it right here, and once again, I'm always, when I go to these, and I was speaking on Monday on this and spoken many, many times, I'm always giving you my personal views, not the view of my firm, not the view of the client necessarily here, because that's the way it always has to go with the speeches. So the way I view this right here is the reason why I believe that this is an antitrust violation. Just to lay it out, I'm going to give you, this isn't going to be a ton of antitrust law, and once again, I'm happy to answer antitrust questions you may have, is because you cannot have a situation where competitors acting together with the primary distributors in a market impose market restraints that guarantee them that regardless of the quality or popularity of their product, doesn't matter, could be better, could be worse, could be the same, they're going to get the vast majority of market access and they're going to get the vast majority of market revenue. Think about if Microsoft did that. Microsoft and 5 competitors got together, conspired with 4 major distributors and said, you know what? We started something really great. So for infinity, we're going to get the vast majority of the revenues and the access, regardless of whether our products get better, worse, whatever. That would be a problem. And Microsoft hasn't done that. But I would contend this is what's happening here. So I want to sort of lay it out for you for how we view it, and then sort of give you some of what the BCS argues are their major responses, to give you a sense, and then open it up for a wide variety of questions. Shoot away at anything. There's a couple things I may not be able to say just because what strategies we're taking right now, obviously confidential information and the like, but almost anything I can pretty much answer. So in terms of why it's a violation, I think you have to think of it in 2 terms, access and revenue. Okay, access has 2 components, revenue has 1. So we're dealing with the access discrimination that's going on and the revenue discrimination that's going on. The access discrimination has to do with 2 different things. It's access to the national championship game and it's access to the major bowls. Okay? The revenue discrimination I'll get to in a few minutes. So with respect to access to the national championship game, the non-AQ conferences, let me step back. The BCS started in 1998. So it's been around about 13 years. The non-AQ conferences, which have 50-some teams, have played around 4,000 games. 4,000 football games since 1998. Do you know how many of those games impacted their chance to win the national championship over the 13 years? None. Not one. Not one time could a non-AQ conference champ have won another game and gotten to the championship. Not one time could they have been undefeated and gone to the national championship game. Bottom line is, since 2004, we've had 9 non-AQ conference teams go undefeated in the regular season. 5 win their major bowl. It's never enough under the BCS. The way the BCS is set up, it's not impossible for a non-AQ to win it all. it's impossible pretty much for virtually any of them to win it all. There's usually one or two each year, like a Boise State, that has a real outside chance, where they don't control their destiny. They got to hope that everybody else loses, and that things break their way and they go undefeated and clobber the other teams. Then they might have a shot. That's one or two. Going into this year, looking at the history of the BCS, we got 120 teams. We want to count 119 because USC was eliminated by their sanctions, right? Out of 119 teams, history showed that 51 of them were eliminated before the kickoff of their first game. 51 done before their opening kickoff. My view, that's too early to eliminate teams, okay? Just a little early, okay? You go into the field knowing you're done. That's the 48 non-AQs, it's the 3 independents, not counting Notre Dame. History shows those guys have no chance. If you say, well, Alan, I'm not sure about that, I question that. Are you really right? Think about Nevada last year, for those of you who are sports fans. Had Nevada gone undefeated, had Nevada beaten Hawaii, had Auburn and Oregon both lost, guess where Nevada would not have been? National championship game. Wouldn't have been there. Talked to many, many experts, everyone agrees. Nevada didn't have the ranking before the season began, they didn't have the prestige, they weren't getting there. You can look at those teams, they're done before the season begins, and for most of them, they're done every year before the season begins. How does the BCS do that? They do it two ways. They have a two-pronged approach. It's first, you limit the number of teams to 2. Cut it down to 2, right? You have it decided by pollsters, computers. By the way, I got to break off here and tell you computers, okay? Computers. The computers decide this. How many people in the room knew the computer formulas, with the exception of one of the 6, how many of you knew it was secretive? Okay. So several people knew it was secret. So if I go to the NFL tomorrow and say, guys, you're doing the tiebreakers wrong, I got a great idea. We're going to just hire anybody, these 6 guys, okay? We'll do computer formulas and we'll keep them secret for your tiebreakers. What do you think? Do I have a chance at staying in that NFL office more than 10 seconds? Yet that's what the BCS does. That's how it works. That's how it works. So we have these computer formulas. We have these 2 teams that get in. By the way, for years and years, it was called BCS and non-BCS. Now it's AQ and non-AQ. So when these guys are voting, when these formulas are figuring it out, do you think the top 2 teams are going to be a, quote, non-BCS school? No, it's not happening. You denigrate them by saying, these are the strong conferences, these are the weak ones. Who's going to name a weak conference to one of the top 2 teams? It hasn't happened in 13 years. If you say, well, you know, the teams weren't good enough. You know, the teams weren't good enough. I disagree with you. I think the teams weren't strong enough, right? You know, your teams couldn't have beaten our team. I heard on ESPN they said you guys weren't good enough. Let me give you the perfect example. 2008, okay? 2008, Florida played Oklahoma for the national championship game. How many of you remember that game, okay? You probably do, the Florida fans, I'm sure do, right? Okay. Florida won. They both had 1 loss going in. How many people in this room think, I can tell you right now, there was not an undefeated team from the Pac-10 that year. I'm going to call it Pac-10 because in those days it was Pac-10, right? How many people think that if there was an undefeated team in the Pac-10 that year, which there wasn't, that they would have gotten into the national championship game over a 1-loss team from one of those other 2 conferences? Pretty much should have been everybody. It's never been that an AQ school, undefeated, gets knocked out by an AQ school with 1 loss. A Pac-10 champion, Oregon, USC, you name it, Oregon State, whoever, would have absolutely been in the championship game that year. So you say, so what? Well, let me tell you the so what. Utah was undefeated in the Mountain West. The Mountain West went 6-1 against the Pac-10 that year. But more importantly, the Mountain West computer rankings, according to the BCS, showed they were a stronger conference than the Pac-10 that year. Mountain West Conference champion had no chance. So you say, why? Mathematically, they absolutely should have been. It's the labeling. The labeling that's gone on. The labeling has changed this, where you're just not going to get that vote. Let me give you a sense from Duke of the labeling. Most of you remember Duke beating Butler in 2010. Few of you are old enough to really remember Duke getting clobbered by UNLV in 1990. 20-year difference, right? Both of those schools were these schools from these minor conferences. The difference was in 2010, everybody was stunned. How could Butler, a non-AQ, even have a chance to get mighty Duke? Back in 1990, UNLV beat us by 30. Beat us by 30. Yet no one was saying, how could little old UNLV do it? Because in those days, there wasn't the labeling. The BCS has created this labeling that has changed the way you view these schools. It's completely changed. In 1990, nobody thought of UNLV as weak. They thought of them as really good. I was foolish enough, because I'm a huge Duke fan, to sit there to watch that game to the bitter end, hoping we could cut it to 24 by the end, just to make it a little more of a game. But obviously, we couldn't get there. The bottom line is they have changed totally the labeling. So at the national championship game, pretty much they eliminate virtually every non-AQ before the season. Let's go to the major bowls. The way the major bowls works, very simple. The 6 AQ conferences, team gets into a major bowl, no matter how weak they are. Their champ gets in no matter what. UConn, not ranked, lost to 4 unranked teams, lost 2 of those games by over 20, 3 of them by over 2 touchdowns. Doesn't matter. You're in. Welcome to the club. On the other hand, non-AQs, at most, 1 gets in automatically. Only once has 2 ever gotten in. And bottom line is last year you have like a Boise State who's ranked 10th, who's lost 1 game in overtime by 3 points. They're out. UConn's in. There's nobody, there's not one person in this room who's going to argue that UConn was a more popular team last year. Boise State, by the way, had the 2nd most popular game of the entire season when they played Virginia Tech. Okay? No one's going to argue that, right? Secondly, no one's going to say that UConn was better. UConn's in, Boise's out. The differences are dramatic. And that's where I'm going to go into not just the access, but now the revenue. If you were going to, and this is the only thing I think I'll call on people, just get, not whoever volunteers, but what do you think? We had a panel on Monday, and we were debating the NCAA and a couple others, and people got this pretty easily. If the BCS didn't exist, did not exist, and you were deciding how much revenue to pay schools to get into major bowls, what would you base it on? So what would you base on? What would be the factors you would look for to say, how much am I going to pay a school that's in a major bowl? What would be the determining things? Anybody?
The TV revenue that you're expecting?
Based on what? Ratings. Perfect. That's one. It's one of the key ones. What are the other 2?
Fans that are going to travel.
What's that?
Fans that are going to travel to the game.
Which would lead to gate tickets, too. And what's the third one? I mean, they're the 2 main ones. You guys just got the 2 main ones. What would be the third one?
Apparel.
What's that?
Apparel, merchandise? Maybe.
A little bit, but what's that real third one? It's sort of related to the first 2, right? It's the quality of the team, right? What's the rankings? So the 3 key metrics you would look at in a free system is TV ratings, attendance, and rankings. In the last 5 years, a non-AQ school, either from the Mountain West or WAC, has been in a BCS game every year. Here's the stunning stat. On those 3 key metrics, okay, 3 key metrics, their worst year of those 5 years, you take their worst year of all 5, on all 3 of those metrics, it beats the ACC and the Big East on their average year. Doesn't matter. Under the BCS, ACC gets 50 million more. So going ahead now to Zach and Shelby, if I said, Zach, you really didn't do that well in that. I'm sorry. You just really didn't. Shelby, great job. Hey, Zach, I'm giving you 10 million more. It sounds wrong up front. Well, that's exactly what they do. That's exactly what they do. Now, you might in this room question that and say, why are you giving them 10 million more? The BCS says, because that's the way it's set up. Okay? That's the way it's set up. When I debated the BCS attorney on this, when I debated him on this the first time, the question came up, why are you doing it this way? Why are you paying 10 million more when they're being outperformed? If anything, they should be paid 10 million less. His answer was, we didn't know you'd be that good. Okay, it's an answer. So I said, okay, you knew it by 2010. Why'd you enter into a new deal that said the same thing? I don't remember his exact response, but the best I recall, it was, next question, please. That's the system we're dealing with. Okay, let's go now to their side. What are their arguments? What is their arguments for why they do it the way they do it? Because I want to make sure we presented both sides. The main argument the BCS makes, they make 2 arguments, one sort of minor, which is they needed to, I'll give you the minor one first so we can spend 10 seconds on it. They wanted to ensure that the 4 major bowl games had real quality competition. Putting UConn in and keeping Boise out, doing the things they're doing, doesn't ensure that. In fact, it ensures the opposite. So let's go to their major argument. The major argument is we wanted to create a national championship game. Before the BCS, we did not have one. We needed to create one, so we wanted to create one. 2 problems with that. One is they haven't created a national championship game for five reasons. So if I'm right on any of them, they lose. 2 is, even if they have, even if I'm wrong on all 5, there's 4 reasons why they didn't have to do it the way they did it. So we'll go through the 5 reasons. And then I'm going to turn it over to you guys for questions, comments, thoughts. The 5 reasons are simple. Number 1, how have you really created a national championship game here? Us in this room, we got about 50 of us. We could absolutely vote on the 2 top-ranked teams in our minds, decide who we think they are. Would that make them the 2 best teams? Absolutely not. We're just voting, okay? Bottom line here is you've constantly got teams who have the same records, who have very few common opponents, if any, who don't play each other. How do you really determine this, quote, off the field? Last year, we had so many people say we got the 2 right teams. How do you know we're against the right team? The record of their opponents outside of Stanford was 52-75. By the end of the year, they hadn't played one ranked team that was still ranked at the end of the year other than Stanford. How do you know we're against the right team? Under that theory, we knew that the New York Jets with Joe Namath were the wrong team. They were from the weak conference. They could never beat the Colts. Well, admittedly, they did because they actually got a chance on the field. I was literally point blank asked by people, why doesn't your conference do what the AFL did? The difference is the AFL got a chance to play the NFL. The the AFL got a chance to actually beat them. These guys don't get that opportunity. So you never get that. If we had had the BCS, you know, if any of you saw that movie Miracles? The movie with the U.S. hockey team from 1980, that movie doesn't exist. Because that U.S. hockey team, it was Russia and Canada. They were the two best. They were from the superior. There's no way the U.S. hockey team could compete with them. But in sports, we do get that chance. Okay? Because in sports, at every level, at every division, everywhere you go, teams lose to other teams. Teams get eliminated by other teams except here. This is the only place where teams don't get eliminated by other teams. They get eliminated, I hate to use the rhyme, but seriously, they get eliminated by a scheme. It's a scheme that finishes you off before you have a chance. So moving on to it, the second one is think of who makes the decisions. It's the Harris pollsters who admitted, like in 2008, we didn't even watch Utah play. A lot of them said that. It's the coaches who are way too busy coaching. And let's face it here, there's a little bit of a bias going into it. And there's the computer formulas that we don't even know what's in them. The third thing is the BCS's argument is the reason we don't need a playoff is very simple. We've got these really good rankings. We've got these great rankings. You know, we know that 2 is better than 3 and 4 because our rankings are so good. If that were true, of course, 1 would be better than 2. Then why does 2 beat 1 virtually every year? Last 9 years, 2 has beaten 1 6 out of the 9 years. Okay? Fourth one is, look at college basketball, look at college baseball. Okay? They have tournaments, right? In the last 14 years for each of those sports, the champion has been one of the 2 top seeds, you know, 1 or 2, in the whole tournament. 4 out of the last 14 years in both sports. That's 28%. So if football is anything close, they're getting it right about 28% of the time. And the fifth one is, if you're eliminating 51 teams before the season begins, you really haven't created a national championship game. But the bottom line is, even if all of that was wrong, the BCS could have created a national championship game and not taken over the 4 major bowls. You could have just had a championship game. You didn't have to take over those other bowls, call them BCS bowls, exclude these guys. They could have created a national championship game and not come up with a system where you say, I don't care if you're better than him, he gets 10 million more. They could have done that. Okay. By the way, their argument for why they couldn't do that, just to be clear, we couldn't give the Big East, the ACC, other teams, we couldn't give them the same amount as you. We had to give them more because we had to ensure they would be in it. So if turn around tomorrow, if you're the head of the Big East, and I said to you, hey, sorry, we're not going to pay you 10 million more if you do worse. What's your options? Where are you going? There's nowhere to go. There's no other tournament to be in. Are you going to join the FCS, go down to the lower divisions? So the argument there fails, doesn't go real far. And finally, there was no reason to create AQs out of all that. Okay, so I did a lot of talking, and we're still only at around about 20 minutes. I want to turn it over for any questions, any comments, thoughts, and hope to have a really good interactive discussion. Yes?
A couple of comments. Try to make them brief, and hopefully you can respond to them.
Sure.
First is, prior to so talking about alternatives to the BCS, right? You have pre-BCS where the bowls act independently and invite schools. And national champion voted on by the Associated Press and the Coaches Bowl. So when has a non-AQ been ranked number 1 in either the AP or the Coaches Bowl pre-BCS? So they're still probably not going to win the national championship under that system.
Can I address it?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. There's 2 ways to view it. First of all, BYU won it in 1984, but let's go past that. So BYU won in 1984. I don't want to look at it the way, I want to look at it as in schools that weren't in major conferences back then, okay? Some of those schools have since moved to major conferences because there was no glass ceiling, okay? I want to ask you a question here. Miami in 1983, let me tell you what they did, okay? Here's my question to you. What do you think Boise State would be ranked if they did what Miami did in 1983? Miami won the national championship, so I want to ask you what you think Boise would be ranked. They lost their first game 28-3. Okay? Not a great start, right? That probably wouldn't help Boise's ratings too much, would I can imagine what the ESPN commenters would say, right? They did get to play 2 ranked teams. They were ranked 18th and 19th before the bowl season. They won those 2 games. Their overall competition had a record of 55 and 55. Miami won the championship with that. They got a chance to play the number 1 in the bowl and win it. What do you think Boise's ranked at the end of the season with that? 12th? 15th? What do you think? Not 3rd. Not 2nd. There is no way in heck. Pitt, 1976. Do you know in 1976, Pitt was an independent, right? Do you know what the winning percentage, when they won the championship, do you know what the winning percentage of their competition was? It's pathetic. It was under 35%. Under 35%. Can you imagine? They were an independent. I could go on and on and on. The bottom line is people are under this misperception. I was asked by one person, well, didn't Miami play all this killer schedule? No, not even close. It's your memory. When you actually go back and look at the facts, Between 1982 and 1991, see if anybody can get this. How many teams from outside of the major conferences won the national championship? By the way, we talked about the BCS starting in 1998. There were 6 years before the BCS. Some of you probably remember this. They were the precursors. It was BCS Light. It was BCS without the Pac-10 and the Big 12. So the 10 years right before we started the BCS and its precursors, how many of those years did a team from outside of the big conferences win the national championship? Do you know? Anybody know? It's the same answer as how many points is a touchdown with the extra point. Okay? 7 of the 10 years. They cut this off. BYU won the championship in '84. We're done. We are not having you guys do this anymore. We'll invite in some. We're cutting you off. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm ready to go to your next question. Of course they have a chance.
Well, I guess the second thing is if you want a playoff, right? And inherently, you know, the NFL playoff works because there's 32 teams. Okay, you have 120 teams here. You compare it to Butler. Butler gets in. There are 64 teams there. If you go to a 64-team tournament in football, you know, that's an extra 6 weeks. Just the physical nature of the game won't allow for it. And so inherently, you're going to have to draw the line somewhere. And if you say that, well, the champion of every major conference just gets into the playoff and then that's the playoff, then I feel like you're penalizing teams. You look at the SEC, then you have Alabama and LSU, you have one champion, and are you really going to eliminate one of those teams to allow the champion of the MAC, like Toledo or whoever that is, and say that they're a better team? Is that really fair? Is that going to provide fans with the games that they want to see generate the most revenue?
It's a great question. It's a great question. So in your first example, were you saying the playoffs would be potentially just the major conferences, or you mean all 11?
No, I'm saying that if someone wants to propose a playoff,
Sure.
the number of teams need to be limited, and where you draw that line is going to be arbitrary. Teams are still going to be excluded. If you want to include some of the non-AQ schools, you're going to do so to the detriment of the AQ schools. I just don't see what works.
Sure. So let me give you my personal view. Okay, once again, personal view on this, because I think it's a fair question. One of the arguments people always make is, and Bill Hancock makes it for the BCS, he always says, well, no matter what it is, if we have 16 teams, number 17 will be upset. If we have 8, number 9 will be upset. Absolutely right. Of course, the difference is number 17 has lost 2 games. They can look at themselves and say, doggone it, we should have won those. These are teams that are undefeated. Having said that, I think arguments can be made on both sides as to whether you automatically invite in a conference champion who's ranked 50th in the country. I think you can make a valid argument. I'm sorry. You're ranked 50th in the country. You're not good enough to get it. Even though you won the MAC, you're not good enough to get in. I think a personal view, I think there's a valid argument that exists for that. It doesn't mean, I hear this thing about 120 teams, and obviously it goes all around in various different ways, but the bottom line is, if you allowed in all conference champions of a certain ranking, and some other teams you wanted to allow in, you would have a very fair playoff if you wanted to do it that way. No, I mean, sure, someone could always say, doggone it, I was a really good 9-3 team and I should have gotten there, right? Of course they can say that. The bottom line is, I'm not going to feel as bad for them because they should have gone 10-2. They should have gone 11-1. They should have gotten there. There's a whole host of ways to do it, where you could do it with 16 teams, you could do it with 8 teams. We don't even have an N1 today, right? We don't even have that right now. So we can end up, I mean, at this pace, you could have a year. You take this year, you could end up with Wisconsin, you could end up with, you know, Alabama, you could end up with Oklahoma all being undefeated. That's chaos for them, by the way. That's chaos, because no one's going to be happy. Last year, if Ohio State hadn't lost to Wisconsin, Oregon would have been the one left out. That would not have been a positive, you know, Nike's behind Oregon. That would not have been a real positive thing for the BCS, I don't think. So they're fortunate that Wisconsin was able to beat them. Bottom line is, there's a whole host of ways to do it. Keep in mind, we've got 89 sports and divisions in college, okay? 89 that determine a national championship. 88 of them do it with a tournament, okay? 88 of them do it with a tournament. So you got this one. You could argue what's the right approach. You're making a good, there's a variety of ways to do it. I have a personal view that I don't think. My personal view is a team that's really weak, who's a conference champ of a very weak conference, should get in. I know people disagree with me. I know Dan Wetzel disagrees with me. I think there's reasonable views on both sides. But having said that, there's certainly so many other ways to do it, you know, that go past it. I want to talk 1 minute about the NFL, because one of the arguments the BCS makes, of course, is, and you've heard this on TV, right? It's the greatest regular season in all sports. You've heard that, right? It's the greatest regular season. I think if you keep repeating it. My argument would be they could keep repeating on TV, the earth is flat. Flat as a pancake. No flatter planet out there than Earth, okay? You could do the same thing. It's totally bogus. When you're deciding what is the greatest regular season in all of sports, in the minds of Americans, what would be the first thing you would think of? TV ratings. Who's watching? The NFL destroys college football and TV ratings, destroys it. The NFL, give you an example. Last year, the NFL's average TV rating for any Joe Blow NFL game was 10.6. Counting conference championship games, counting them. College football, 3 games above 5.3 all year, including the Boise State Virginia Tech game. If you thought about it, you could guess the other two, both of which involved Auburn, South Carolina, Auburn, Alabama, which was ranked first. Okay. Bottom line is you're destroyed. Now, why? You could talk about the NFL's history, you could talk about a bunch of things, but one of the reasons is the NFL doesn't eliminate 42% of its teams before the season begins. It doesn't eliminate most of the rest in the first month. It actually has something where you're still alive. I've had people tell me, hey, Alan, I really think that people who love Nebraska are going to watch their team all year. That's true. But there's a whole lot of people who are only going to watch Nebraska if they're still in it. The bottom line is when Michigan and Ohio State played 3 or 4 years ago and they were both playing for the chance for the championship, it got a 13 TV rating. Last year when they were playing a big game, a huge game, if Ohio State wins, whether you like it or not, they were in a major bowl. It got a 4 rating. A 4 rating. They're playing for the Big Ten championship for Ohio State, a co-share of it, to get into a major bowl. Its rating was less than 1/3 what it was a few years ago because people outside the Big Ten didn't care because it had no national championship implications. Zilch. And that's what people care about. People care about you playing to win it all, not necessarily just for runner-up spots. When I say people, I'm talking about casual fans, I'm talking about a lot of different fans. There's the diehard Ohio State, Michigan fans that watch the game. That's how they get the 4 rating. Don't get me wrong. You still get people watching. You don't get anywhere near the same. The bottom line is if they go to a playoff, when they tell you they have the greatest regular season, all of a sudden this would turn around dramatically and they would start to approach. I'm not going to say get to the same ratings as the NFL. I'm not going to go there because I don't know that. It would get so much higher regular season TV ratings. After 3 weeks of this season, 3 weeks, you're mid-September, 90 of the 120 teams are effectively eliminated. You've gone 3 weeks into the season and you've eliminated 3/4 of your teams, according to the history of the BCS. That's what they do. So when they, and by the way, the BCS is one of their arguments is every game counts. For those non-AQs, as I said to you before, no game is ever counted. And frankly, in no sports does every game count, right? No sports does every game count. But in this sport, it probably counts the least. Because what the BCS always points out is that game in week 2 was so important. Well, yeah, and when you lost, weeks 3 through 12 didn't count. So they're always pointing to the one game that they're saying was more important, and they're not pointing to. When I did this statistics, and I did it, frankly, on my way down here a couple years ago, doing the stats for it, I found out there's about 400 more games this season that would have national championship implications if you would just go to a playoff. 400. Some years it's going to be 300, some years it's going to be 450. It's a lot of games. I'm trying to give you that when you're hearing on TV it's the greatest regular season, to me that's literally saying the earth is flat, flat as a pancake. They can keep saying it, and if you haven't really thought about it, you may actually buy into it. Smart people who I deal with all the time, including someone who I won't name because he's very well known. I don't want to put him in the spot. He's like, this is such unbelievable BS. It's incredible. Someone very connected in with one of the networks too. So let me turn to. But those were good questions. Let me turn to someone else.
So I think the overwhelming majority of people agree with you that a playoff would just be better for all the reasons you mentioned. But I'm kind of wondering, just realistically, how we get to a playoff. Is it actually through an antitrust challenge, or is it a matter of just kind of waiting for public pressure to build, or is it the super conferences ultimately developing? I'm just sort of, I don't know. Maybe I'm just very pessimistic, but I just don't sort of see playoff happening anytime soon.
Well, you're pessimistic because it hasn't happened, and we've waited years. And let's face it, you can read articles from 2001 that talked about there should be a playoff. It should start next year, and it hasn't happened. So we've had 10, 11, 12 years of people saying this is an absurd system. I think it's going to, the one thing I'll say, I have answers I could say more in private, but the one thing I think I'd say publicly is I think waiting for it to happen is probably a non-starter. I don't see the public pressure alone being enough to move them. I mean, the former athletic director of Boise State, Blameyer, said the BCS, in his congressional testimony, the BCS never does anything unless pushed. Never does anything unless pushed. And he was right. They've never done anything without being pushed. And by the way, I thought you were going in another place, so I'll just answer, but a place that people really are also interested, because you've got an excellent question, which is, why don't they just switch? I mean, come on, if it's so much better, if the regular season's going to be better, or if that's going to be better, why don't they just switch? And my view of that, personal, having lived this for 3 years, is you have a variety of college presidents who are way too busy to be focusing simply on the BCS. Read what the University of Connecticut president said about 2 weeks ago, which is one president can't make a difference. One president really can't change things. These people are in a position where they're not exactly getting together and voting this. You have a very small inner circle that pushes the direction they want to push on this. And when I debate the BCS Council, let's really be clear what he says. He says, if we go to a playoff, and I assume if he's debating me and saying this to me, I assume he's saying the same thing to his clients, the BCS presidents, right? He says, if we go to a playoff, you will make $600 to $700 million more in the postseason. I grant you that. You'll lose the same amount in the regular season because you'll kill the regular season. That's like me saying, let me make sure I get to you the argument is, the NFL is killing the regular season. Admittedly, they're the most popular sport by a million miles, but they're killing it. All they need to do to make their regular season great is get rid of those pesky playoffs. Wow, eliminate 42% beforehand, eliminate most of the rest in the first few weeks, and the NFL will take off. Okay, that's the same argument, yet he's making it. And they make it with a straight face. And it's time for people to realize it's BS. Let's go to the next argument. The next argument, the one we haven't talked about, is the bowls will be destroyed. The bowls will be destroyed. There will be no bowls. In fact, they used to start out literally to say if you add one game, you add an and one, all bowls will fold. I mean, if you believe that, I've got bridges that I would love to talk to you about because I can discounts, 30% off. Really, I mean, if you buy that they add one bowl, the other 35 fold. And yet that's where they started. Now they have been moving from that position. They've been sliding down from that position to now where many bowls will be harmed, everything else. But keep in mind, here's the thing. I had to sit back, because remember, I've been doing this for 3 years. I had to sit back early on, and I would hope you guys would do the same thing and analyze it. What's it take for a bowl to survive, right? What does it take for a bowl to survive? I came up with 5 things. You can tell me if you disagree. By the way, I had a bowl guy on the panel the other day. He didn't say anything to the opposite on this point. 5 things. It takes teams. Do you think 7 and 5 teams are still going to play in bowls? I think so. Absolutely. Do you think bowls are still going to want to do it? These guys are making $500,000 a year to work 3 weeks, $400,000 to work 2 weeks. I think you're still going to have people that are interested in holding those things. Okay? 2. 3, you need to have a network. Well, ESPN already owns some of the bowls. ESPN doesn't have a ton of great programming to show in mid-December anyway. You're going to need advertisers. Let me just tell you, if you have ESPN, you have advertisers. And now you're down to the last one. You need ticket sales. Going to your point, you need ticket sales. Right now, they're forcing universities to pay to force them to buy 15,000 tickets when they get to a bowl. Well, if you go to a playoff, where all of a sudden these universities are making collectively another $700-800 million a year, you've even got more money to pay for the tickets. So you've got the 5 things you need. So the argument that the bowls will all fold, the truth is, today, many of these bowls survive for one reason, those forced ticket sales. Without those, they would fold. But the forced ticket sales keep them alive. Those forced ticket sales will even be easier in the future with that sort of money. And the last one, because this is a law school class, I should raise it. The last one he raises is, you will be sued by the bowls for antitrust violations. A playoff very well may be an antitrust violation in the BCS's attorney's mind. I think that is absolute baloney. In fact, I said at one panel, you know what the BCS attorney calls a playoff? He calls it likely, illegal. It's not illegal. It's not any more illegal than it is in the 88 other sports that have playoffs. It's not illegal in pro sports. It's simply not illegal. And if there's any doubt, you could tweak the playoff to be, he's basing it on some case that I could go through with you, but if there's any doubt, all you'd have to do to make a playoff 100% legal, no question about it, is to say to someone, hey, you don't want to be in the playoff? That's cool. You go to a bowl. We're absolutely fine with it. You go to a bowl instead of the playoffs. Explain that to your alumni, explain it to your fans, but we're fine with it, okay? We're totally fine with it. Then you absolutely have it be legal. So that's part of what's going on here, and I think your question is a great one. Getting the public message out there is really important, but there probably is going to have to be more because the public message has been out there. The public doesn't like it. It got a 10% approval rating in a poll a couple years ago. It's really struggled, as you can tell. I mean, Congress is 14%, the BCS is a 10. Okay? What can I say?
How many games would you be proposing to add to the season, and what's the impact on the student athletes?
Sure, it's a great question. So, frankly, I'm talking personal again. I'm open to anything that changes this from here. You know what I mean? There's a lot of different ways you could do this to change it. Obviously, they added a 12th game. Before they added a 12th regular season game. You could end up going, a bunch of people are talking 8 teams, which is 2 games. You're talking 16 teams, which is 3 games. One other concept to this would be if you actually did what the NFL does, and you said, there's not going to be a stoppage of the clock after every first down. According to Dan Wetzel's book, that would reduce the number of games, the number of plays you would play in a season by about a game's worth, which is one thing you could also do to reduce it. I think the student-athlete issue, the way I look at it is this. In high school football, they play about 15 or 16 games, which would be about the same you'd end up playing under this, okay? State champions, excuse me. In all the other divisions, they play about 16 games. So here you may be ending up playing actually 17. Obviously, the NFL is playing in the mid-20s if you get to the Super Bowl. So it's not that different, and they would be getting several weeks off of rest as well, between the the bowls, between the end of the regular season and the games. With respect to academics, it really bothers me when BCS people make that argument at all. And frankly, they don't a lot. A lot of them, John Swafford in his 2009 testimony, ACC commissioner, really said, I think he said, if I remember, really I think he argued academics for half a sentence, and a number of people said it's not that. Because really, if you want to talk academics, let's talk about UConn, let's talk about college basketball, let's talk about 4 weeks where they're away from class during midterm. I mean, that's real academics. This is more over winter break anyway. And and truthfully too, I think, let me talk about the student athletes. If you go to a playoff, think of it this way, okay? We're going to make hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions more dollars. Some of that is going to hopefully go to the tutors to help these people, one. Some of that is going to be used, so we know, universities this year, 98 of them lost money on their athletic department, on average 11.3 million. Where's that 11.3 million coming from? Where's the athletic department grab the 11.1 of two places, right? Your tuitions or the academics. They either say, we're going to have to slow down. Now you wouldn't need to do that nearly as much. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying all 120 schools would necessarily make money. Some of the bottom ones probably still wouldn't. But a ton more would be so much better off, and you wouldn't be pulling so much into academics. And frankly, my last point on that is you're helping them with tutors, you're helping them stop pulling from the academics, and frankly, you're not sending the wrong message anymore. The message right now, when I started with Zach and Shelby, a great job, Shelby, not so good, Zach, here's 10 million more, I don't think that's a great message. And the message that says no matter, what Bill Hancock will say is no matter, they say to them, what do you say to a team that's undefeated, and didn't get there? And he basically says something like, try better next year, try harder next year, whatever the comment is. It's really hard to say that. In my mind, that's really, to me, that's condescending. You know what I mean? Bottom line is you're 12-0, you can't do more. There's nothing more you can do. And people say Boise State should play a harder schedule. I'd say live the life of the Boise State athletic director, okay? Those aren't the easiest phone calls. You can call whoever you want. They're not playing. They're not coming to Boise. Most of them aren't letting you come to their place because the last thing they want to do is be losing to a Boise State, which hurts them out. Now, I'm not going to mention school by name. I'd say it privately. There are some schools that lose to bad teams 70-0. Their athletic directors' phones are ringing off the hook. Everybody wants to play them early in the season. You're an automatic win. You have a 0% chance of losing. Literally a 0% chance of losing to them. And so they can't get enough calls. Everybody wants them to come to their place. It's a great event. You know you're going to win by at least 50. And, think of it this way. The way the BCS system is set up, there are so many coaches and athletic directors who get a month bonus for just getting into a bowl. To get into a bowl as an AQ, you need to win 6 games. To win 6 games, you play 12. Most schools play 8 conference games. If you can go 4-0 in your non-conference schedule, you only need to go 2-6 in conference schedule to get a 1-month bonus. It doesn't encourage playing really tough teams. I will give credit to the Oklahomas, the Miamis of the world, despite Miami's problems. They will play hard teams. They will play hard teams, but most of them won't. I mean, you look at some of the schedules of some of them, I don't want to say by name, some of the schedules this year, and they just play 4 teams that are really, really weak. Start off 4-0, and then go from there and obviously get to a bowl.
If the BCS or the AQ conferences really wanted to exclude these other teams, why wouldn't they just knock them down to FCS? And then no one ever argues that an undefeated SCS team doesn't deserve the chance. So I'm just curious why they can't just exclude everyone else and just form an FAS or something. I don't know.
They call it Division 4. It's what is and it's a great question. It's a great question. Would they do that? Could they do that? Would they want to do that? There's a lot of, I'll tell you, there's a lot of disagreement over that. Okay, why? In other words, the thought process is, one of the arguments being made against that, just to give you, is they don't all want to go 6-6. They're worried about who they're then going to end up playing, so they don't all go 6-6. And how that would all play out, how that would play out politically. Excluding people is really hard. Once people are included, it's very hard politically to exclude them. A couple years ago 1 year ago, when they were talking about, all of a sudden having, and maybe it's going to be one day from now, who knows the way things are playing out, right? But a year ago, they were talking about the Big 12 imploding, right? That didn't go over well with some people at the Hill for some of those Big 12 universities that weren't, going to be, you know which ones I mean. The ones who weren't going to be in real good stead if the Big 12 imploded. They weren't going to be the ones with the home. And the pressure, I think, was going to become unbelievably intense if that occurred. So there's a bunch of dynamics. It's a great question, but there's a bunch of dynamics that go into it. that I don't think makes exclusion the easiest thing to do.
In your playoff system, are you proposing that the games are just like home and away games, or do you see it incorporating the current bowl games? Because if it does incorporate like the Rose Bowl, for example, with how powerful like their lobby is, how could you force them to have like a non-Pac-10 versus like Big Ten matchup?
It's a great question. Okay, I want to be really clear. I personally don't have a playoff proposal or one that I'm allowed to talk about publicly, so it's a great question. So here's the thought. Couple things. Let me say it right? You could do a playoff proposal in which you would basically end up with virtually Big Ten, Pac-12 every year in the Rose Bowl. You could do that. My personal view is if you had a number of rounds, I wouldn't want every round to be at bowls. I don't think that's the right call on that, for a lot of reasons. I mean, you don't want to have people traveling every week. You want to have fans at home. There's so many different ways to do it. And I don't want to speak on behalf of the Rose Bowl, and I can't speak on behalf of the Rose Bowl, but I can tell you in conversations I had with the Rose Bowl people, they don't view themselves as part of, quote, the BCS. They view themselves, this is the most I think I can say publicly, they view themselves as very separate from the BCS, extremely separate. If I went up to a Rose Bowl person and said, hey, I know you guys, the BCS, are thinking, we're not the BCS. Okay, so I think it's a good question. There's a whole lot of ways to do it, and you have to think that through and get to the right way to try to incorporate it in. I know Dan Wetzel's book obviously put the bowls to the side and just had his own 16-team playoff. And others have the bowls in every round. And another option would be to do a combination.
I mean, this might be more specifics in the playoff system, but teams that are in no conference, how are they dealt with? Like, for instance, let's say the Big 12 does dissolve, and there are teams, perhaps like Oklahoma, that are not in a conference come 2-3 years from now. Or if Notre Dame suddenly becomes good again or something, how do teams, how would you incorporate, this to me seems like a playoff system would be very conference focused. It would be wouldn't differentiate, but it would be very conference focused versus, basically the non-conference schools are in the same boat as the non-Qs right now.
I think if you had a playoff and you didn't have, it's a great question. There's 4 independents now. There could end up being more or less. I mean, there's rumors of BYU going to the Big 12, so it could end up being one less than it was before, and others could join in and become independent. Absolutely. I think if you had a playoff proposal that didn't have an at-large element to it, I think that would be a real problem with respect to the independents. I think you'd have to have an at-large element so that an independent who's really good could get in. Or otherwise, once again, in my view, personal view, you're not having a national championship game. If you're excluding a 12, let's face it, between all of us in the room, there's a 0% chance you're going to exclude a 12-0. There's a 0% chance. It's never happening. But having said that, you'd have to make sure there was a way to include any independent who was really strong in it. You're right. You were.
You mentioned the president's not focusing on the issue too much, but it seems very strange right now that the colleges are outsourcing and allowing third parties, the bowls, to control their most profitable product. What is the reason why there's so much inertia to bring in that money? Because it just, from a business sense, it just doesn't make any sense why they're allowing 35 bowls, 32 of which are broadcast by ESPN, to run their biggest, best product of the year. What's going on there?
Boy, you had to have read Death to the BCS by Wetzel. That was almost word for word from this. Yeah. So, because and listen, on that issue of the bowls, why they're allowing it, I go back to what I said earlier. I don't know for sure. I'm not on that side of the fence. It doesn't make sense to me. From the way it's done right now doesn't make sense to me. The way, in personal view, but I can tell you that I'm just giving my personal view again. If I'm a president, I don't know, a ton about the BCS. I've got a million things that are out on my plate, and someone comes to me and says, Alan, if we go to a new system, we're going to make no more money because we're going to gain money in the postseason, we're going to lose in the regular season. Remember how your players loved Alan going to that bowl a couple years ago? They're not going anymore. The whole system will fold. And you're going to be defended in a lawsuit by the bowls and a likely loser on an antitrust violation. Well, I think all 3 of those are 100% bogus. And I would stake a lot on that. I mean, a lot on that. That's how strongly I feel. It's like when your plumber comes to you and says, I'm sorry, you need the new toilet. You're not sitting there thinking, I really need to go into this and see if there's another way. This is your expert. This is your expert telling you what it is. I think the message hasn't gotten out there nearly enough to people of how this goes. At a conference, I can certainly say this, at a conference I spoke at the sports law conference, the guy from Penn State, the lawyer from Penn State said, why aren't they doing it? And I gave this, And I said to him point blank, I said, when have I ever talked to the presidents on your side? When? All they've been hearing, he goes, well, never. And I said, well, they're hearing one message. They're hearing one message. And it's, I go back to the question before about can you get the message out there? I don't know if you can get it out there well enough. For some reason, I think, that these are the trusted advisors who say the same things, and they may believe it. I don't know whether he believes what he says or not. I have no idea. All I know is I don't believe it, and I don't even think it's credible, to be honest with you. I don't think it's credible, any more than I think it's credible to say that that pro football would do so much better if they just eliminated 42% of its teams before the season begins. I don't think that's credible. I think they're the exact same argument, and I think they both fail equally. In fact, one of the main arguments this goes to your question originally. One of the main arguments the BCS makes for the regular season. Let's lay it out. What's their number one argument for why the regular season is hurt? You know what it is, right? It's 2 words, right? Basketball tournament. It's basketball tournament. Basketball tournament has hurt the regular season in college basketball, and therefore we'd be worried about it. And first of all, you could debate that. But let's say, for purposes of argument, he's right. The answer here is, I would agree. I think it was you're the one who said, I would totally agree. You have a 68-team football playoff. That would not be, in my opinion, that would not be the best thing you could do for the regular season, okay? No one is talking about that at all. And one, I heard, I think it was Dan Wetzel say recently, basketball and football are different. Wrong argument. Not wrong argument. The difference is it's the numbers. It's the numbers. Why is Major League Baseball looking to add 2 more teams? It's to enhance the regular season. By the way, don't forget, Major League Baseball had its most exciting regular season at the end of this, end of, 2 weeks ago, like a week ago? That doesn't happen under the BCS. Those teams were long eliminated. That's done. Those games were meaningless. The games that are so exciting. And as I said, some of the most exciting moments in my life have been the Jets championship over the Colts. Not exciting in a good way, in a bad way, coming from Baltimore, but exciting nevertheless. And also, the hockey team. Those sort of things. The Red Sox winning it in 2004, was great, but none of that happens under the BCS. So those are the things. I think it's an excellent question, but those are some of the stuff that's going on. We still have a few more minutes for questions, comments, thoughts. Yes?
Last night I watched that Brian Gumbel show on HBO, and they had a segment about the tax-exempt status of the bowls, and how they're characterized as charitable organizations, but they pay their executives $500,000 for a few weeks. They don't really give to charities. They give only like 50% of their revenue to schools. So could you challenge the whole bowl system for being illegal, as violating their tax exempt status or something?
We, and representing the Mountain West and, Boise State, we're still in other words, if a playoff, and once again, I'm speaking for myself, but if a playoff occurred, I can tell you the Mountain West and Boise would still want there to be bowls. There are groups like Playoff Pack that you guys may have heard of that have, actually don't represent a client, but have gone out there on their own just to try to push it, who have really pushed the envelope with the bowls, who I think, I forget the latest, are still attacking some of the bowls on the tax-exempt status. It was actually my understanding was reporters out in Arizona that uncovered the Fiesta Bowl scandal, and then Playoff Pack kind of jumped on that bandwagon and really sort of amplified that message. At least my understanding from one of the reporters out there is he's the guy that just uncovered it, but it kind of got blurred into the press. So I think there are groups that are absolutely looking at that. There's groups that are focusing on that. And, and I heard the Sugar Bowl has a concern now as well that they're looking into, nothing like what the Fiesta Bowl was. Did anybody in this room read that Fiesta Bowl report? That was anybody? This is a kind of report that you don't have to read the whole thing. You could start reading somewhere in the middle and just tell you, if you read 5 pages, let me tell you the next 200 are very similar. It's unbelievable. I don't want to characterize it, it's an unbelievable report to actually sit there and literally read page by page of it. It's difficult just for someone to sit there and digest because of sort of what was alleged and how the witnesses were pointing in a certain direction. But it's an interesting one if people have time to at least read a few pages. Did you have a question?
I have a question. So one of the arguments you hear sometimes is that all these private arrangements between conferences and bowls prevent kind of an obstacle to leaving those bowls behind. Is there any merit to those arguments?
No, for 2 reasons. One is, I think the main reason is you don't have to leave the bowls behind. In other words, seeing this for the 3 years I've seen it from, between the conferences and the bowls, there's no question who controls this system. Okay, there's no question. It's the conferences that control this system. It's not the bowls. In my view, the Orange Bowl had 70% higher ratings before the BCS and its precursors and since. Okay, in my view, that if the Orange Bowl came out tomorrow and said, "Hey, doggone it, I don't want to be with the ACC anymore. We're not happy with it," the BCS would say, "Well, Cotton Bowl's been asking us for years, it's great knowing you. I mean, that's my view of where they come out, my personal view of how that would come out. So I think there's ways to incorporate bowls, there's ways to keep them involved, and still do those connections. I don't think that's what's preventing it at all, because this is the conference decisions more than it is the bowls. Sure. Okay, so in closing, I think, how many of you in this room, if any, are interested in doing sports law? Anybody? Okay. So let me give you the advice that I was talking to someone the other day about this, and actually the guy who's the head attorney for the ESPN, and I was saying, I get asked by a lot of people who want to do sports law. So it's turning away from, I think we had good discussion with BCS, but turning away from that. A lot of people want to do sports law, and he's asked all the time, what's your advice? What should you do? How do you get into sports law? He said he can't tell you how many people tells him, I want to become eventually the attorney for the Red Sox. I want to do this. I want to, general counsel for the Red Sox, of which, of course, there's one. And he said the bottom line is, the key here is, he said, find a way to get into a legal environment in sports at the lowest of levels you can. So you are helping out a single A minor league baseball team, doing something for them with contracts. You're doing some way of getting yourself in and then building. It's not illogical. In fact, I thought it was very logical and well put. You're finding some way to get in a door and start to build your resume up. And I know some of you have already been doing that, to start getting involved in sports. It doesn't necessarily mean you're locked into what you're doing. Let's say you do minor league baseball. That doesn't mean you're locked into baseball at all, let alone the minor leagues, obviously, which you wouldn't be. But it's a way to get in a door and a way to find yourself helping out a team or helping out some sort of situation that you can get into. I think what's really cool about sports law is if you have a passion for sports, the analysis is all still there. I mean, one of the questions I'm always asked with the BCS is people always ask me questions like, well, shouldn't it be legal for blah, blah, blah reason? And my answer so often is just take it out of sports for a second. Just take it out of sports and assume this was, the oil industry. Would you be saying the same thing? And the answer is always no. So it's the same thing here. When you get into sports law, you get the fun of having the substance of sports, but still the exact same amount of analysis you have on the legal side. So I would highly recommend it for those who are interested. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.